Ladies and gentlemen, is path tracing going to be the future of video games? It didn't seem too long ago that the buzzword that everyone was discussing was hardware-based ray tracing. You know how new buzzwords seem to come and go all the time when it comes to video games and tech? And of course, hardware-based ray tracing was really kind of on the tips of everyone's tongue when Nvidia announced the RTX 20 series. And then with the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X consoles, when they launched, they also supported it. So yeah, ray tracing really got into the spotlight. But there have been a couple of very interesting things recently. The first is several pieces of research that Nvidia have publicized, and these concern, well, as you probably guessed, path tracing. Plus, and this is actually something that's just recently occurred because this script has been something I've been working on for a while now. RTX 40 seems to officially support path tracing and being marketed around this. An RTX 4090 box was photographed, and assuming the image is genuine, and it does seem to appear so, well, path tracing is right there on the marketing spiel. So in this video then, I want to discuss what the differences are between path tracing and ray tracing, and perhaps most important of all, how these two technologies are going to coexist and how they're going to improve your gaming experiences. But you guys know what's coming next, the video's sponsor. And of course, since you're probably going to be building a new PC, since just about everything's going to be released over the next couple of months, it may be of interest to you. If you're running a copy of Windows 10 which isn't activated, of course, not only do you have to worry about the missing customization options, but there's also that annoying Windows desktop watermark reminding you to activate. Today's video is sponsored by WhoKeys.com, and they have an excellent price on Windows 10 Professional as well as Home keys. Yeah, and they also of course sell games. I've bought a few Windows 10 keys with my own personal account to test everything was legit and worked in preparation for this sponsored video. You can pick up one of their keys for 25% off using the coupon code RGT in the checkout. There's links to their website in the video description. Also, if you're building a few systems, there's bundles available too. Again, you can check out WhoKeys.com and use the coupon code RGT for 25% off the listed Windows 10 key prices. In the real world, everything we see is a mixture of light and shadows, colours bleeding into one another, and reflections look absolutely beautiful. A pond perfectly reflecting the trees surrounding it, for example, or a skyscraper in a city. But in video games, reflections haven't been so easy to create. In fact, while of course lower resolution and model quality is something that you can easily pinpoint on, let's say, a PlayStation 2 or a PlayStation 3 game, you can look at games of that era and also notice that shadows and lighting certainly are not anywhere close to the technology we have today. It wasn't until the PlayStation 4 kind of era that we really started to see technologies such as screen space reflections become commonplace. But even with those technologies, there are a number of limitations. For example, a reflection could only appear on an object which existed within, well, screen space. Objects which fall outside of the camera's viewpoint without some clever trick simply do not exist, or more accurately, they are not rendered according to the game's engine. There are no shortages of ways developers, artists, and game designers are investigating to solve these problems in lighting, but ray tracing is perhaps the most exciting and certainly has captivated a huge number of people. It solves a plethora of problems with its adoption while creating a number of others, not least of which is running ray tracing and not killing your frame rate. Ray tracing in games though isn't just about better reflections or nicer or more realistic looking scenes, but it also increases immersion and realism, such as being able to see an enemy which is approaching you from behind, for example in various surfaces, not just say glass, but even in something more subtle such as a puddle or perhaps the knob of a door. You can also imagine things such as being able to see an enemy which is higher ground than you, which could cast a shadow. Insert the reference to the Nazgul and Frodo here. So while many modern GPUs have been capable of running ray tracing since the launch of 2018's Turing architecture from Nvidia, ray tracing isn't a new prospect or technology. Strictly speaking, the principles have even existed for decades. The Lynx 1 computer graphics system was created way back in 1982 in the Osaka University School of Engineering. There were 3 professors, Omura Koichi, Kawata Toru, and finally Shirakawa Iso, led a project with 50 students, and they helped create an interactive ray tracer. This pioneering work was built upon over years, and then decades, long before the modern era of video games. Movie studios leverage expensive technologies and ray tracing. Although not quite in the same breath as modern games, the 2006 Cars movie from Pixar even had a pretty interesting research paper on ray tracing used within the movie. Ray tracing on traditional rendering techniques though, when scenes are created and rendered for a movie production, be it Pixar or just adding visuals to, well, anything, render time just is not a big deal with these productions. Sure, it does cost more production time and cost in terms of financial capital, but for example, in 1991's smash hit movie Terminator 2, about 15 seconds of footage with the T-1000 took about 10 days to render. Ouch. For interactive experiences though, such as games, frame time budgets are critical, and until pretty recently we just have not been able to run these calculations necessary for real-time ray tracing. We don't have hours, minutes or seconds to generate a single frame of animation. Even a very modest frame rate target of 30, honestly that's not really acceptable for many PC gamers, especially in an action title, means you need 30 new frames per second, which is essentially just 33 milliseconds to render each frame. For more action-orientated games though, you want to at the very least double this FPS target, and thus halving the frame budget. So the frame time goes down to just 16.6 milliseconds. Nvidia were the first to work through the problem, and the fruits of their labour was the Turing architecture, powering the RTX 20 series of graphics cards which launched in 2018. Nvidia's strategy was to include dedicated RT cores, which help calculate the intersection between a pixel and a ray of light, and then use other technologies such as denoising and also provide DLSS or Deep Learning Supersampling. This helps up performance by reconstructing the image from a lower resolution image, such as 1440p, to a higher resolution image, such as say 4K, using a mixture of machine learning, temporal data, which is basically previous frames of animation, and other technical wizardry. I don't want to spend too long on the history here, and suffice to say AMD's RDNA 2 architecture then launched, offering ray tracing to AMD owners, though in a very different way. They basically reusing the TMU units of the GPU to provide ray tracing capabilities. AMD's design offered less performance, but is perfect for console-based SoCs and saves die space. Nvidia since doubled down on this with RTX 30 Ampere, and if you've had even a passing interest of technology, you'll know that RTX 40 and RDNA 3 rumours and excitement have been the focus of PC hardware news of late. So, in part 1 of this video, I want to discuss mostly the research papers that Nvidia themselves have placed online, as well as some of the discussions. Of course, I will also leave a link to them in the video description. In part 2, when RTX 40 is formally announced and we actually get our hands on one of the cards, and we can start to actually test some of the software, because don't forget guys, it's not just a case of the cards are launched, or maybe a demo. It's going to take a while for developers to really start to get a handle on things, much like ray tracing, but there will be a second part to all of this, and it's going to be very interesting to see how developers leverage path tracing. But also understand that I'm going to be simplifying a number of these topics rather greatly. Not only because many of these research papers are really lengthy, but honestly, the tiny minute details are probably going to be lost in the vast majority of people. Now, if you are interested in computer graphics and ray tracing or developer or something like that, then of course I would advocate heavily that you read the papers yourself. So instead, consider this as a way for us all to kind of get to a point where we can have at least an idea of what the differences are and where the future may lie. And while path tracing isn't a new technology, in fact we've seen titles like Quake 2 RTX utilize path tracing previously, Nvidia seemed to be pushing it heavily with RTX 40. But it's going to be, as I mentioned a moment ago, a number of months, possibly years, before it becomes commonplace in gaming. I suspect it's going to be subsequent architectures like Nvidia's Blackwell, which seems to be RTX 50, where we really just see path tracing become pretty commonplace. But still, there's a lot of stuff to get through here. So now that we're all on the same page, ray tracing can be more accurately thought of as simulating lighting and shadows in computer graphics. Millions of rays are shot into the scene, with these rays interacting with objects in various ways, including reflecting or refracting. The rays bounce around, and the more rays you can fire into the scene, the more objects this light can bounce from, and of course correspondingly the more information you can grab from the scene, with some big caveats such as denoising, which we'll get into in just a moment. These rays then pass through the scene, and the GPU knows how to propagate both direct light, i.e. say a lamp which directly lights a can of cola in front of it, and indirect light such as say a can of cola inferring its colour to the surface of, let's say, a table. We're going to be showing various gameplay footage here, and for this capture I want to thank a couple of companies. We're using an Intel i9-12900K, courtesy of Intel, an Asus ROG Strix Z690 DDR5 variant, which is courtesy of Asus, and 32GB of Vengeance DDR5 memory and an RMX 850 series PSU. Thanks, by the way, to Corsair for both of those. Finally, pulling in graphical duties is an RTX 3080 Ti. This was sent to us by Nvidia for the review of the card's launch. Ray tracing then can either augment or replace traditional shadows and lighting techniques, depending on how developers and performance targets align. In a game such as Control, for example, we can see how the surroundings change significantly with ray tracing on and off, with the Federal Bureau of Control becoming just more alive with reflections and lights. We'll look at more examples as we go through the video, but you can see how the glass reflects the objects of surrounding offices, how the lighting details beautifully paint into the scene so much more accurately than, say, screen space reflection. Control provides you, control of a number of settings, which enable you to enable or disable ray trace reflections, and of course, frame rates directly reflect, see what I did there, the additional work that you're asking the GPU to perform. Obviously, an Nvidia high-end RTX card or a high-end AMD card are much more capable of the ray tracing effects that perhaps would be quite desirable than, let's say, a PlayStation 5. Thus, if a developer is targeting a console, typically they pare back ray tracing significantly, or they offered various modes for performance and so on, so people can choose what type of look they want to go for. There are tons of other titles which of course do implement ray tracing now, especially AMD being in on the act, and I think as we move into the next generation of consoles, ray tracing is going to become extremely prevalent. Some titles such as Cyberpunk, it looks absolutely phenomenal, and it's actually, I know it's a cliche to say, but kind of a game changer. As a general rule though, the more rays which are shot into the scene, and the more objects that these rays can bounce from, both primary, in other words the first thing they touch, and secondary, i.e. other objects which might reflect the light from the first bounce, the better the visual quality. Unfortunately, to fire off enough rays to account for all of the needed visual detail is not currently feasible. On either RTX 40 or even an RTX 50 card, hypothetically, it'd be much better spending the performance in other ways, hence denoising and other technologies which we're going to be discussing in this video, and also some of the technologies which of course are going to be required for path tracing, and some of the research which most likely is going to be finding its way into RTX 40 and how it's going to evolve most likely for RTX 50. Now, not only do we need the technologies we're going to be discussing in this video, but there is also reconstruction technologies such as Nvidia's DLSS, which I've just mentioned, as well as AMD's FSR2, which is coming on leaps and bounds. There are several other alternatives, including work that Epic are doing with Unreal Engine, but again, optimizing and improving the efficiency of each and every step in the rendering process is critical. So we've gone quite a long time into this video, and we've been discussing ray tracing, which can be thought of as hybrid rendering. Essentially, you're augmenting traditional rendering techniques with shiny rays of light. But then there's path tracing. Think of path tracing as taking the traditional rendering techniques and then you throw them out the window. Path tracing is what seems to be the focus of Nvidia going forward. Now it will, as I've mentioned, take quite a long time for path tracing to become extremely prevalent in gaming, but path tracing has immense potential. Essentially, the rays of light now create everything, the entire world, rather than, let's just say, calculating a shadow. There are already path tracing titles available, including Quake 2 RTX. This takes Quake 2 by id Software and uses a custom RTX renderer from Nvidia, although it does work on AMD hardware as well, but it was originally released for Nvidia, and it's built using the Vulkan backbone, and it modernizes it, quote unquote. We'll talk more about this as we go through the video, but path tracing is extremely expensive. While hybrid ray tracing hits frame rates, again depending on which ray tracing effect is enabled, resolution, the card you're playing at, the angle of the sun and the moon, path tracing dials this up about, say 5 billion%, with even the most modest resolutions such as 1080p or 1440p hitting an RTX 30 card or an AMD card very hard. And it's no wonder, again, traditional rendering has taken all but a back burner to path tracing. The ability to run this at all in real time would have seemed impossible back in, let's say, 2016. But it can look impressive. While much of this technology is still in its infancy, and we're still taking our first journeys, well, I think you'll agree that Quake 2 is at the very least worth messing around in its RTX form. There are tons of quality options here, where you can mess around with environmental options. It's a staggering insight actually, not just into ray tracing and path tracing, but just how lighting and just the general ambience of a level can have huge impacts in how you perceive it. It can look shiny and nice and pretty and cute, well maybe not cute, it is Quake, down to kind of spooky and almost horror vibe. Might I stress that this is built on the backbone of a game which was launched back in the late 90s, just really using a shiny new renderer. But now we've laid some of the basic groundwork, there's a lot of interesting research Nvidia have been investigating on its goal to get real-time path tracing and improve ray tracing performance. This is going to be extremely important, of course, for RTX 40, but you can also see the building blocks of later subsequent Nvidia cards. I'll be doing a more in-depth analysis of the path going forward for Nvidia in a separate video, as well as AMD, as there's a lot to go through here. But again, this is just to serve you the basic understanding of what's going on. In fact, just as a reminder, if you missed my disclaimer from earlier, well, the papers and research here are pretty complicated, and so I'm going to be going into this with just a general overview, but do check the links down below. So let's get back to Quake 2 RTX, because the developers have added a few very handy options. Again, the entire game is path traced. Assuming you want to, you can also enable the standard renderer. Not that you'd want to if you could, but anyway. There's also various visual options, including whether you enable denoising or disable denoising. Now, denoising, which is used in Quake 2 RTX, is not as advanced as the technologies that we're going to be discussing in this video. But I do want you guys to get an understanding of what's going on here. Notice without denoising, it looks kind of like an image that someone has taken into like Adobe Premiere or Photoshop and then just basically added a noise filter through it. But what's really going on here isn't really noise in the traditional sense. It actually is, well, basically there's just missing visual details. There's simply not enough rays which are shot into the scene to fill in each and every pixel and object. In essence, the GPU engine just cannot generate enough rays to make a clean image. Again, it has frame rate targets to hit. Unlike a movie, you can't wait 2, 3, 5 minutes for a single frame. You need to get X number of frames for it to even be playable. Therefore, the missing detail can essentially be thought of as looking as noise. In reality though, this is good because developers have technology to circumvent this issue, and it's going to be getting a hell of a lot better as we're going to be discussing. Denoising takes the rays in the scene and essentially fills in the missing or visual details to create a cleaner looking image. Like ray tracing and even path tracing, denoising isn't a new term, or even something that's just been, kind of created recently. Experiments in denoising in the Monte Carlo renderings actually began in 1994 by Rushmere and Ward. But of course, technologies, strategies, and designs have evolved considerably, particularly with video games, Nvidia and AMD's own research. So let's discuss one of these research papers, shall we? We've kind of skirted around it long enough. And the one to begin with actually is perhaps one of the more tantalizingly named ones: Research Advances Towards Real-Time Path Tracing. Sounds like just the job, right? Nvidia actually show us their path tracing prowess with 2 demos, but both are running on a single RTX 3090 at 1080p. This is actually a very good sign. From what we understand, RTX 40 is considerably faster, of course, especially in ray tracing, and there are numerous software advances here. In fact, the demo here is not even utilizing all of Nvidia's technology. We'll get into that in just a second. The first demo has a tiger running through a dense jungle, with tons of shadows and indirect lighting from foliage surrounding the tiger. There's also an overhead canopy too, and basically the scene is pretty complicated. At one stage, the camera pans back, revealing a vast jungle. There's about 30 bounces of light here. A staggering number, really. That's a crap ton of work for the GPU to do, and it's all because of the intricacies of the fur and other foliage. The scene averages around 3 billion triangles, and around 3.5 million hair segments. I mean, that's a lot of triangles, and it's kind of freaky as someone who grew up with, let's say, Virtua Fighter 1 back in the day. Despite all of this, the single RTX 3090 maintains just over 30 FPS throughout the experience. The second demo is inside a Paris opera house. It has just 3 bounces, but 160 million triangles with 500,000 emissives and 30 spotlights. That's a lot of emissives. In very simple terms, think of emissives as stuff which can reflect or radiate light. Combine this with a large number of spotlights, and it just creates a highly detailed scene when it comes to lighting anyway. Again, Nvidia managed to lock around 30 FPS through this experience. To be clear, these are not offline rendered. They are running in real time, the camera can be adjusted, the scene can be adjusted. And again, think of it as we're seeing this on RTX 30 technology with not all of the stuff running compared to what Nvidia can actually bring to bear. So how does the basic path of ray tracing work? So let's go through the basic flow of a ray for path tracing. Firstly, a ray comes from the scene's camera, i.e. the viewpoint of the scene. In real life, you could think of this as your eye shooting laser beams out of them, which scan the detail of the world around you. Yes, you are now Cyclops from X-Men. Thank you. In this example though, the beam hits the green pixel, which you can see on screen. Just to be clear here, depending on the scene, millions or billions of rays could be going pew pew pew. After this though, the ray bounces off of the bottom surfaces and then gathers indirect illumination data from the spotlight you can see on the top there. The ray then continues to travel, and eventually it hits a glass object. Here there's a random chance that the ray could do a couple of different things. It could either reflect back, or it could refract. With this particular example, Nvidia have assumed that the random chance will be it refracts. So its path will adjust due to the refraction, and as you can see, its path adjusts accordingly, with the ray eventually going on its merry way. But the actual path tracing pipeline is a little more complicated. Generally speaking, there's a V-buffer pass. This sets to a single ray per pixel, designed to figure out the basic visibility and layout of the scene. This path is important because this information is then used for direct illumination, the path tracing itself, as well as any post-processing effects. Next, direct illumination, utilizing Nvidia's RTX Di, analyzes the primary light sources of the scene and sends this directly into the path tracer. Path tracing then handles all lighting and details such as reflections, transmission events such as, say, light being refracted, And optional stuff such as subsurface scattering, SSS, basically means that light can enter, say, a character's skin, which would help it look more translucent and natural, and then scatters and then re-emits. Again, this is something that we've seen in games more recently, and is definitely a big visual upgrade. So now let's talk about another method for global illumination, Radiance Caching. Now notice the flow in the previous path tracing thing we just mentioned does discuss Radiance Caching, optionally. While the example being shown in the Tiger and Paris Opera Houses were pretty cool, they did not actually show off Radiance Caching. But it is suggested for interactive content, which those actually are, and of course it would also include games. Radiance Caching is basically another method for global illumination, and it works directly with the path tracer. For clarity's sake, I want to be very abundantly clear here. Direct light is, well, or an emitter, which falls directly on an object. Basically think of, say, a flashlight hitting something, say a wall. Global illumination, though, is light which has been reflected from other surfaces. With Radiance Caching then, Nvidia have created a system leveraging a lightweight neural network which is trained on the fly, that's very important, with scene information to realistically mimic the impact of global illumination. The system is fully dynamic, taking into account a plethora of factors such as how light falls or reflects on surfaces. What is that material like? Is it glossy? Is it rough? How will it diffuse? Further Radiance Caching ensures shadows don't actually bleed through solid surfaces, such as, say, a wall, which is not quite how real life works. As you know, you don't really see a shadow go through a wall, and works in conjunction with Nvidia's restir, which again is something we're going to discuss in just a moment. Now, as you can expect, Nvidia leverages its tensor cores for the neural network, and also the RT cores for ray tracing. The headline, though, at least according to Nvidia, is when combined with restir, we're looking at up to 100 times increase in GI efficiency, achieved again on an RTX 3090. We're looking at about 1 billion GI queries per second. A number of paths are fired into the scene, and they basically bounce across just a few surfaces. For those paths, or light if it's easier for you to visualize, which exit the scene, nothing happens. They're basically just discarded and they go on their merry way. But for those which do end up within the scene and do stuff, quote unquote, data such as location of objects, what they interact with, roughness, transparency, and other details are grabbed, and this can be fed back into the neural network, the Radiance Cache, and so on. And this continues and continues and continues to help predict how the scene should be globally illuminated. According to Nvidia's own numbers, on the 3090, we're looking at over 1 billion of these GI queries per second, and again, because it's being run on the fly and can run concurrently with live gameplay, this is basically, by the way, training is when the neural network is learning, but then is inference which is doing the entrained task, and both are basically happening simultaneously. But there's another lot of cool applications for the small lightweight neural network, not just graphics but AI and tons of other cool stuff. So now let's switch to restir. With Nvidia's own blog post as well as accompanying research papers, proudly, understandably, given what's being achieved here, at least according to Nvidia, this boasts the ability to render millions of real-time dynamic lights. Generally speaking, for a moment, older titles will typically work with baked-in lights, i.e. non-dynamic lights, for the vast majority of the light sources in games. But important lights, for example, let's say a character's flashlight, that of course will be somewhat dynamic. Even more recent RT games, well, they will of course push physically correct shadows with ray tracing, but just because of the sheer number of calculations involved, games typically now only have tens of lights. Now these are capable of dynamically interacting with the environment, such as casting a shadow, but it's not quite what Nvidia have managed to achieve here. So the team of researchers created a very intriguing technique. This, by the way, is being built upon, and the restir technologies are quite numerous. I'm just talking about a couple of very interesting bits here. You can actually do quite a lot of rabbit hole diving, if you will, to this topic. Benedict Bittrell, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, provided a pretty good overview of how this works. He's one of the team who crafted Restir. He made the paper. Our key insight was to reuse information from spatially and temporally adjusted pixels to inform which rays to trace. This idea resembles modern post-processing denoising and anti-aliasing, but whilst denoising filters out pixel color, we filter probabilities to help guide rays to reduce further noise. That's certainly a lot of fancy words, but ultimately, spatial data, think of data within the screen, and temporal data, basically path frames of animation, are reused to improve performance. According to the team, they utilised an unbiased Monte Carlo estimator for this approach, and with unbiased, it's 6 to 60 times faster than a state-of-the-art method, but using a biased estimator reduces noise even further and is 35 to 65 times faster. This, by the way, is at the cost of some energy loss, but I think it's more than worth it, particularly when it comes to gaming. So what exactly is biased versus unbiased? Well, an explanation that was put forward by Chaos, this is the creators of V-Ray amongst other cool software. Unbiased basically means there's no shortcuts taken when calculating a renderer. Each ray is treated equally, so there's no bias in terms of importance. But perhaps a better understanding is through iRendering.net, you can see on screen. In a nutshell, biased renderings use technologies to optimize the creation of the scene, but it does so at the cost of some physical accuracy. In the case of Nvidia's example though, we get a cleaner image, improved performance, but some of the lights and shadows are not quite as accurate. In my opinion though, they're still impressive and more than sufficient for games usage. There are many other research papers, and quite frankly I could make this video several times longer because I'm only scratching the surface here, and AMD also have a number of cool pieces of research as well, and again RTX 40 is going to be out relatively soon. So I think I'll be doing a lot more in-depth analysis basically, but there are some other very curious things, including volume restir. This basically offers ways to render volume rendering, to be clear this is smoke, dust, explosions, with drastically improved performance versus similar methods. Here we can see the baseline comparison uses 4 or more SPP, samples per pixel, versus the single SPP of volumetric restir. Again, despite all of this, the image looks cleaner with less noise and better visual quality. So in closing then, this video ended up being a little different than I'd originally planned it to be. Not only were there a number of rabbit holes that I found myself going down with the research, but also a couple of sources which I'm probably going to discuss in a separate news video kind of gave me some insights into things as I was going through the video. And furthermore, of course, Nvidia themselves seem to be almost at this point hinting that path tracing is going to be part of the RTX 40 series. Now, how it is exactly implemented, how important is as a feature for you, especially at launch, is going to remain a mystery. And it's going to be very interesting to see how developers are empowered to utilize path tracing. Obviously, Nvidia, touted ray tracing for, developers to just work, quote unquote, but at the end of the day, it does require an awful lot of optimization. And with the fact that the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X are just nowhere near capable of running path tracing, it's going to be very curious to see how developers leverage it. I suspect it's not going to be until the next generation of consoles that we see path tracing become prevalent in PC gaming, but at the end of the day, as always, you have to make a leap somewhere, and I suspect that some games are going to look absolutely amazing in the next couple of years on PC. With that said, thank you very much for checking out the video, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.